Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. We begin with war fighting, politics later. There are many political turns these last days, but the war goes on. And my war reporters, Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's Long War Journal, Tom, Joscelyn, and Bill Roggio are here. This is a vast landscape. We're going to travel from Afghanistan to Syria. We'll point towards Africa, but tonight we're going to spend a whole lot of time in Syria. There have been changes in the lineup against the Russians. I begin with that change reported by Tom Joscelyn. Al-Nusra Front, that is the local version of Al-Qaeda, is teaming up with two of its sister organizations, perhaps brother organizations, Aral al-Sham and Ajnad al-Sham. Tom, a very good evening to you. Is this significant in that the Russians are forcing the gangs together? Good evening to you, Tom.
Good evening, John. Well, these gangs in particular in this case were already together in a lot of ways, and they've formed several coalitions throughout Syria. But I do think you're seeing some realignment of sorts within Syria to counter the Russian intervention. And in particular, it could empower within the rebellion even more so Al-Qaeda and its allies, which are already the strongest part of the insurgency against the Assad regime. And you can see that Al-Qaeda, which is represented by the Al-Nusra Front in Syria, they're one and the same, Al-Nusra Front is Al-Qaeda, has been really gearing itself up to try and market itself as sort of the tip of the spear to go after Russian forces in Syria, along with its allies. And so these groups are really making a big push now to try and muster the efforts of other groups, many of which, or at least some of which, may not even be full-blown jihadist organizations, to at least come together against Russia.
These groups joining up with al-Nusra, do they operate as a group like an Army Corps would operate, battalions interrelating with communications, or do they just not kill each other? How do they regard teaming up?
Well, the way they describe it is as joint operations rooms, where basically there's a unified chain of command to bring together all the military assets. The reality is, John, is that when you walk the cat back on these operations rooms, every time you're going to find basically Al-Nusra Front and Arar al-Sham, which are the two of the main groups that are fighting the Assad regime in Syria. You're going to find them at the top of the heap, at the top of the chain of command in these operations rooms. They're the ones who are really directing things. And Al-Nusra Front, like I said, is an official Al-Qaeda branch. Arar al-Sham is closely allied with Al-Nusra, and if it isn't an outright Al-Qaeda front, and may very well be, and we think it is, then at least it's closely allied with Al-Qaeda.
Do any of these groups enjoy the generosity of the American people with weapons?
Well, what's happened here is Al-Qaeda and its allies have formed these Jaish al-Fatah coalitions and other coalitions throughout Syria. These are a series of regional coalitions led by Al-Nusra Front. And it was this coalition, for example, that overran much of the Idlib province earlier this year. And this, in part, is what forced the Russian intervention in the first place. What we find is that basically these Free Syrian Army groups that are receiving tow missiles and other supplies, they oftentimes will fight underneath or as part of the Jaish al-Fatah coalition. But there's very good reporting, and no one should make any mistake about it. This doesn't mean that they're truly independent groups that are a real counterweight to Al-Qaeda and the extremists in Syria. Actually, there's very good reporting in the New York Times and other sources where some of these rebels have said, look, Al-Qaeda wants us to keep getting these tow missiles from the U.S. because we're going to use them against the Assad regime and now the Russians and others, and they can take advantage of that, but ultimately they're in charge.
Bill, a very good evening to you. The U.S. Special Forces, a rescue operation, many hostages freed, one KIA, a member of the Special Forces. This is in the area of Kurdistan, central Iraq. There's video right now. I just saw a piece of it on CNN. It's also available on websites. The puzzle here, Bill, Special Forces, they're very bold people, and they plan very carefully. They didn't look like they were training anybody, Bill. It looked like a combat operation. The only training I saw was that they were training their weapons on the hostages. Does the U.S. military, does CENTCOM have an explanation for how these advisors are training Kurdish hostages?
Good evening, John. No, they don't. This is really merely kabuki theater from the Department of Defense. They don't want to call this. The reason is they're saying that this is part of a training mission, is that they don't want to say that the United States military is conducting combat operations in Iraq, because we all know that President Obama ended the war in Iraq when the U.S. troops withdrew in at the end of 2011. So you can't have a war, and there can't be a combat operations if a war is over. So, but in reality, when you watch this video, you see special operations troops that look like actual troops in combat, and they were in combat. Look, Delta Force is not going to deploy as part of a training mission. They're not military trainers. Delta Force is a counterterrorism, shock troops. They're highly trained that don't conduct training missions. They kill. They kill and capture. That's what they're out there to do. If the U.S. is using them in a training capacity, then they're being misused. So it's really frustrating to watch this, and it's silly. You have Secretary of Defense Ash Carter saying it's not combat operations, and yet he says that they were in combat. But just because they were in combat doesn't mean it's a combat operation. So, you just got to channel George Orwell and get to the Ministry of Truth to figure out what is really happening.
I have a breaking news story, Bill, from the Washington Post. They put this up within the last half hour. This might help clarify or muddy the story. This is from Missy Ryan and Greg Jaffe reporting for the Washington Post. The president's most senior national security advisors have recommended measures that would move U.S. troops closer to the front lines in Iraq and Syria, officials said, a sign of mounting White House dissatisfaction with progress against the Islamic State and a renewed Pentagon push to expand military involvement in long-running conflicts overseas. Bill, this sounds like the eve of combat operations, doesn't it?
Oh, of course. I mean, you don't deploy troops to the forward line of battle without them, without expecting them to be in battle. But we won't call it battle anymore. We'll call it something.
They're frontline trainers, yes. The debate over the proposed steps, which would, for the first time, position a limited number of special operations forces on the ground in Syria and put U.S. advisors close to the firefights in Iraq, comes as Defense Secretary Ashton Carter presses the military. Bill, they've run out of explanations for the trainers that we see in the video. They're exhausted. They're clearly going to go to English.
Yeah, look, I think they're going to try and run out the clock on this one, hoping that the media attention gets diverted to the next shiny object in the room, and I don't expect the media to press them real hard on this. They're just not going to.
All right, but there's some key words here. Front lines. There's a key word, Bill, right?
You would think, right? I mean, look, you would think that, it was a campaign province for President Obama, and it was, a major selling point in his re-election campaign. And you would think that someone would be really interested in seeing why a U.S. soldier died in combat that wasn't combat in Iraq.
Quickly, Tom, you have an item up that's turning into news down under Australia, where they're coming summer and going to enjoy the Barbie. This is a story about an unnamed moderate, Al-Qaeda moderate, comparing the Islamic State to Al-Qaeda. Who is he?
Well, he's identified in this new jihadi publication out of Syria as Usama Hamza Australia. Australia is, of course, their way of connoting the fact that he's from Australia. And the interview identifies him as somebody who served in the Australian military before joining Al-Qaeda in mid-2001 and eventually becoming a senior Al-Qaeda trainer who was dispatched by Al-Qaeda senior leadership to Syria to train forces for the Al-Nusra Front. We were about to report, and several sources have told us that it is highly likely that, in fact, this individual is a guy named Matthew Stewart, who the timeline of his career matches what is known about Matthew Stewart, a service member of the Australian military who, in fact, did join Al-Qaeda in mid-2001. That hasn't been 100% confirmed yet, but that seems to be the case. This is who this is. The interview is interesting because it confirms something we've warned about on your show and in various interviews and various writings. Al-Qaeda is using the Islamic State and its brutality to portray itself as the moderate jihadist alternative, as something that's acceptable to various players who want to support the insurgency against Assad and want to support other efforts around the region, in fact. And this is a very dangerous development because Al-Qaeda is actually triangulating off the Islamic State to gain more popularity and support.
And the revelation that this is Matthew Stewart, does that change Australia's opinion of this rogue in any fashion, that he's now boldly giving interviews? Listen to this. I've been a Muslim for over 14 years. I embraced Islam in Afghanistan in July, August 2001, a month or two before 9/11. And then he goes, referring here to the blessed attacks on the Twin Towers. I was involved in fighting in the invasion. So they've known about this fellow for a long time. He's just doing PR now. Is that what's new?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's been silent for a very, very long time. There was a video that surfaced of him basically a couple years after 9/11, or a video that's thought to be of him, and then basically he disappeared. He went silent. But this is the interesting thing about all this, John. This is what we're sort of obsessed with at the Long War Journal. Al-Qaeda has a saying, those who work in silence. This is one of those guys who was doing that. He was working in silence basically for the last decade. Nobody had heard from him. Nobody knew what he was doing. Meanwhile, he had become a senior Al-Qaeda trainer, and we can only guess how many people he now trains in guerrilla warfare fighting techniques, which is what he explains in the interview.
Tom Joscelyn and Bill Roggio, Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. When we come back, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, not on the run, in Helmand province. What is the significance? I'm John Batchelor. I'm John Batchelor, Long War Journals, Tom Joscelyn and Bill Roggio. We leave Syria and go immediately to Afghanistan. Bill's report about two reports from Helmand province, a Taliban report and an Al-Qaeda report. Let's begin with the Taliban report because they're threatening the capital. What is the significance of threatening Helmand? What is Helmand, Bill?
Yes, John. Helmand province, this is basically the heartland of the Taliban, particularly central and northern Helmand and Kandahar make up are the homelands or the heartland of the Taliban, and this area, Helmand, where the fighting is going on, it's also where the opium is. Most of the opium in Afghanistan is derived from. So it's really strategic terrain for the Taliban and for the Afghan government. We've assessed at the Long War Journal basically that all of the northern provinces, 6 or 7 provinces or districts in the northern part of Helmand, think of them as counties here in the United States, are either Taliban controlled and contested. And over the last weekend, the Taliban basically are pressing on the outskirts of Lashkar Gah, which is the capital. It's of Helmand. It's in the central Helmand province. It's along the main road that links with Helmand, Helmand with other neighboring provinces, including Kandahar. So what we're seeing in Helmand, in northern Helmand province, is basically what we saw in Kunduz several months ago, in April and May, when the Taliban began pressing and taking control of areas around Kunduz city and then ultimately launched its assault. I think the Taliban are probably better placed to do so in the south than they are in the north, but I think they're taking their time consolidating control over areas that they need to.
Where's the Afghan army, Bill? Where are they? Have they bugged out? Are we there? Anything there to resist this?
It's unclear. The U.S. is providing air support. There's reports of U.S. advisors with the Afghan forces.
Trainers.
Afghan military is engaged, but they routinely abandon outposts. Afghan police, they brought in special operations police, or I guess you call them SWAT units or type of equivalent units. That have been brought into Helmand province to fight the Taliban. And last report over the weekend was the Taliban were in control of areas up to about 3 to 5 miles of the provincial capital.
And the second report from Helmand is Al-Qaeda's operating a training camp. For whom?
Yeah, and this was Tom and I wrote this article. So what we have in southern Helmand province in Dishu district, there's a town called Baram Shah. And Baram Shah historically has been used by Al-Qaeda to operate training camps. In fact, in 2010, when the U.S. military retook the area from the Taliban, it explained that foreign fighters were using the area for operating training camps. Foreign fighters are, of course, of Al-Qaeda, and that it was used to support the Taliban operations and drug trade and whatnot. Then in 2014, you have reports after U.S. forces withdrew that the Taliban were back in control and operating training camps. And now we're seeing reports of Al-Qaeda operatives as well as operatives from what is most likely Lashkar-e-Jhangvi as well as Indian Mujahideen. These are Pakistani and Indian jihadist groups that are allied with Al-Qaeda. They have sent operatives through, and also an Al-Qaeda trainer has been identified as being operating in one of the camps.
So they're recruiting in India, and they move them into Afghanistan to train them, and then they feed them back to India? Do we know where they go?
Yeah, no, that's exactly correct. Yeah, and Bahram Shah has been identified in all three of the instances that we were able to pick up in the press reporting. So we're two operatives, or I think it was 2 or 3 operatives in Pakistan and 2 operatives in India have all gone to Bahram Shah.
Tom, you have a report
locally. They go to Afghanistan, they get their training, and then they try and come back. And these are just the ones that are captured by Indian or Pakistani police. And these are just the reports that are come out. And as we know, usually it's far, far worse than what we're just seeing. And the press reporting is maybe the very, very tip of the iceberg.
We move from the subcontinent to Africa. Tom is reporting Al-Shabaab, last operating across several borders in East Africa, now contesting Islamic State's expansion. How so, Tom?
Well, there's been a lot of reporting, a lot of it driven by Islamic State propagandists, that a significant portion of Shabaab was going to defect from the Al-Qaeda camp to the Islamic State. Now, Shabaab is a good case study for anybody that wants to understand how bad the reporting has been on Al-Qaeda all these years, because Shabaab has long been Al-Qaeda. It was groomed by Al-Qaeda to become a regional branch of the organization, which means that they represent Al-Qaeda throughout the entire East Africa region. So all the jihadi efforts in East Africa on Al-Qaeda's behalf take place through Shabaab and on behalf of Shabaab. Well, the ISIS propagandists have really been pushing hard to try and get Shabaab to defect to the Islamic State as part of the Islamic State's expansion. They've clearly grown these provinces in several different countries, the Islamic State has. However, they've not seen a lot of defections of Shabaab, and just recently there was reporting that about 20, up to 24, but about 20 different Shabaab fighters defected to the Islamic State and announced that they're now part of the so-called caliphate. Well, this is, really a small cadre. This is not a very big number of defectors at all. And actually it shows that the ISIS propaganda efforts have pretty much failed thus far to actually garner a lot of support within Shabaab. We expect that there probably will be more defections, but to put this whole thing in perspective, right now, after over a dozen videos and months of trying to proclaim that Shabaab was imminently going to defect to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the Islamic State can count just 20 fighters in East Africa, and that's a ridiculously small number compared to Shabaab's ranks, which are at least several thousand, according to the State Department, and probably even more than that.
And right now, as ISIS continues to boast, is there any indication that there's fighting between these two groups, or is this just in the Internet?
Well, this is something we reported on social media, and then sort of the Voice of America had a good report on it, and I think there's still more reporting to be done on this. Whereas ISIS, the Islamic State, has been very loudly calling for Shabaab to defect to its ranks, Shabaab has been very quietly taking out the ISIS defectors. So guys who are actually trying to defect or want to actually have an upstart Islamic State presence in East Africa have basically been herded up like sheep and executed or detained. That's what they've been doing quietly. And so that's what part of the story is about, is that Shabaab has been taking out anybody who tries to actually become a defector.
Tom Joscelyn and Bill Roggio, they keep the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's Long War Journal. We moved very quickly from Syria to Iraq, the rescue at Kurdistan by trainers, U.S. Special Forces Delta Force. Then we moved to Helmand province, that's in southern Afghanistan. And then finally to East Africa. You see the scale of the attacks. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.